Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. Ernest Shackleton. More than 5,000 men read this ad in the newspaper and signed up to be a part of the expedition. But why? Why risk it all to go on an expedition with impossible odds? It's because of this man, Ernest Shackleton. In 1902, Shackleton was part of Robert Scott's expedition to reach the South Pole, but the expedition failed. In 1908, Shackleton again tried to be the first to reach the pole, this time leading his own expedition, but turned back only 97 miles away to save his men from starvation. He was knighted for his efforts on that expedition and became known throughout the world as a hero. In 1911, to Shackleton's dismay, Roald Amundsen became the first to reach the South Pole. So Shackleton changed his goal to be the first to cross the Antarctic on foot. Out of the 5,000 men that signed up, Shackleton chose the best 27 to join him. He called his ship the Endurance, and on December 5th, the Endurance left South Georgia Island, headed towards Antarctica. What Shackleton would accomplish on this expedition would challenge the impossible, push the limits of human endurance, and would be remembered for decades to come. Shackleton's extraordinary leadership skills crossed humanity's frontier of survival. His actions would inspire many important leaders, like Jim Lovell, the commander of the Apollo 13 mission, and Richard Danzig, former Secretary of the Navy. While Shackleton was preparing for the expedition, an international crisis was occurring. When World War I started in July of 1914, Shackleton offered his ship to be a part of the British Navy, but was declined and told to continue with his preparation to leave. With the permission of the government, Shackleton assembled all of his materials. These included a 300-ton wooden steam engine ship named Endurance, a 27-man crew, 69 sled dogs, sleds, axes, ropes, and other tools. Just 2 days after the Endurance left South Georgia Island, the ship entered the pack ice, an extremely dense variant of ice. The farther south they sailed, the denser the pack ice was. For a month, the Endurance struggled through the pack ice until disaster struck. On January 18, 1915, the pack ice surrounded the ship, making it impossible to move. One crew member described it as, quote, like an almond in a chocolate bar. For months, the crew, including Shackleton himself, endeavored to break the ice to free the ship. Part of the way Shackleton led his crew was by breaking hierarchies. Not only did the crew take shifts breaking the ice or doing chores like scrubbing the floor, Shackleton would also do this to show his men that he works just as hard as them. In between shifts, Shackleton even organized soccer games for the men. But the main source of morale came from the sled dogs. Each man created strong connections with them. On August 1st, the pack ice trapping the ship made it list to one side. For the next 2 months, the crew would hear the cracking of beams and groaning of planks, becoming more intense as time went on. By October 27th, the men had completely abandoned the ship, as it was too dangerous to stay on board. At this point, Shackleton knew they could never reach their goal to cross Antarctica. It was clear that he needed to change his priorities. On November 1st, Shackleton and his crew set up camp about 1.5 miles away from the Endurance. Shackleton knew morale was draining, so he purposefully salvaged the banjo from the ship so the banjo player could entertain the men. He also salvaged playing cards, tobacco, and treated the men with decent meals when he could. His efforts seemed to be working, but soon all morale would collapse. On November 21st, the men watched as their beloved ship got crushed by the ice and sank beneath the surface. Shackleton did not let this tragic moment break their resolve. He put the men to work, setting up a new camp. Shackleton knew this was a pointless decision, but he did it so the men felt like they had a purpose, that even if their progress was slow, they were still getting somewhere. On December 29th, they set up Patience Camp, where they would stay for the next 5 months, planning for the day they would escape for land. One of the many problems the crew was facing was that the dogs required lots of food, and Shackleton knew he would have to let them go soon. During tough decisions like these, Shackleton liked to spread rumors in order to give the men time to digest what needed to be done. Eventually, on January 14th, Shackleton had one of the men take the teams of dogs and shoot them. During this time, Shackleton personally talked to the men that had the strongest connections with the dogs in an effort to keep their minds off them. Shackleton would have personal conversations frequently with every man to ensure that they all had a healthy state of mind. Months later, on April 9th, the ice around the camp began to crack, revealing open water. Shackleton described, quote, "Our home was being shattered under our feet." Shackleton put everyone in 3 lifeboats and they sailed away from Patience Camp. For almost a week, they survived in the small lifeboats in grueling conditions. Finally, on April 15th, all 3 lifeboats made landfall on Elephant Island. For the first time in 16 months, the men stood on solid ground. Shackleton knew they could not stay long. Elephant Island was out of the way of shipping routes, so there was no chance another ship would see them. In addition, the blizzards on the island made their experience wet and dangerous. After 9 days, Shackleton volunteered to row back to South Georgia Island, where he would acquire the materials to rescue his crew. With 5 other volunteers, Shackleton left the island on one of the lifeboats, leaving the remaining 22. They sailed over 750 miles in 2.5 weeks and finally made landfall on May 10th. Unfortunately, they landed on the wrong side of South Georgia Island. Shackleton and his small crew were forced to cross the extreme mountain range that divided the island. When they finally reached the whaling station on the other side, Shackleton told the man in charge that, quote, "We have lost our ship and come over the island." The manager was surprised, as no one had ever crossed over the mountains before. He asked him who he was, and he responded, "My name is Shackleton." The whalers were deeply disturbed, as Shackleton was a name revered among all sailors. As Shackleton described, quote, "Our beards were long and our hair was matted. We were unwashed and the garments we had worn for a year without change were tattered and stained." Over the next 4 months, Shackleton funded and led 3 rescue attempts that were all turned back by ice. Luckily, on the 4th attempt, in August, he made it to Elephant Island. As Shackleton approached the island, he saw that all 22 men that stayed on the island were alive. He had completed his mission. He managed to pull off the most incredible accomplishment in exploration history, not by crossing the Antarctic, but by keeping all of his men alive, a rarity in Antarctic exploration. Shackleton crossed frontiers in survival and leadership, becoming the highest model of perseverance, leadership, and endurance. When Shackleton and his men returned home to England, they found that their incredible journey was eclipsed by the Great War. Although Shackleton was not truly appreciated then, over the course of time he has become an inspiration for many other leaders and frontier crossers. One great example of this is Jim Lovell, commander of the Apollo 13 mission in 1970. During the mission, an electrical malfunction forced the 3-man crew to abandon their ship and take shelter in a small lunar module. Under near-fatal conditions, the crew improvised and made alternate plans to propel themselves home to Earth. Jim Lovell later said, quote, "People like Shackleton and myself are individuals who can take on challenges that might include the unexpected." In 2000, Lovell visited the South Pole and said about Shackleton, quote, "I think he took the same attitude we took on Apollo 13. You have to look forward as long as there is a chance." Another great leader inspired by Shackleton is former Secretary of the Navy, Richard Danzig. As Secretary, Danzig held seminars on Shackleton for his officers and provided books about the Endurance expedition, all in an effort to encourage Shackletonian leadership in the Navy and the Marine Corps. Danzig has said, quote, "The values of leadership he provides are eternal." Although Shackleton set out to be the first to cross the Antarctic, he ended up accomplishing something much greater. He showed the world what a truly effective leader looks like. Shackleton kept all of his men alive because he crossed frontiers in leadership and survival. As a result, Shackleton has left a legacy not just for Antarctic frontier crossers, but to astronauts, Navy men, and more. So while the Endurance might have been crushed that disheartening day in 1915, Shackleton's endurance defied all odds and has left an eternal legacy that calls every one of us today as we face new frontiers.